this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Chatham, and this is the Beirut Banyan. Before we jump into anything that we're going to discuss, I think it's very important to explain the if you will, the 3-point plan to interviewing Jessica Obeid. Step 1, make sure there's electricity. And last week when we were supposed to do this, I thought you can't make this stuff up. We're getting ready, we're both prepared, and there's no electricity on your side, and they're at the country, there's no electricity. So I thought that was appropriate. That should be an episode on itself. It's like trying to call you and there's no electricity. That's fine. Step 2. Today, making sure a number of things are working. First, that there's electricity. Second, that the internet is working. And I think we had, are there 3 connections that we tried today?
Yeah.
Okay, we're on number 3, I guess, or maybe number 2, I don't know. So that's also quite entertaining for me. It's sort of making sure that we can actually do this. Step 3, which is the most important one, and thank you for reminding me, it's the most important part, the laptop charger. So as soon as you went to get your charger, I actually plugged mine in as well. So we have a common problem on that side. First of all, thank you for staying up so late to talk to me. I really appreciate that. I know it's past 9 p.m. in Beirut, but that means a lot to me. And I know people have more free time during coronavirus. It still doesn't matter. To me, it's an honor. So thank you for that.
It's my pleasure being with you, really.
And the second part is I'm glad that we're doing this at a time that I think the subject is probably the most important one. And I'll explain why I have that particular opinion. It's probably one you share. It's an ongoing problem for Lebanon, but it's reached a zenith point, and we can get into this. The third reason I'm happy is because you're the first person I speak to on this subject. We don't really know exactly what the problems are all the time, but we've all experienced this problem just by being in Lebanon. We all know what this whole topic is about. So before we jump into that, just your own immediate experience with coronavirus now in Lebanon. How's your routine been? And I mean this in both your personal life and your professional life. How are you navigating this sort of the later stages of coronavirus? And I'm just curious how your own life has been impacted.
So it hasn't been much of a disruption because I work from home originally. So aside from the fact that I cannot travel anywhere, and that does cause a bit of disruption to my work, it just kind of business as usual, just working from home. So, but of course, once you have constraints of not being able to go out in specific times, then it just psychologically you feel like you want to go out more, of course.
Right.
I'm worried about so many uncertainties like everyone else. And of course, because COVID is just a multiplier of the threats and the vulnerabilities of each country. So I'm just worried a lot of how this is impacting Lebanon and the economy in general. I
know that I just by following the news that there's been some partial reopening and it's sort of taking hold. Do you sense that things are beginning to return to, and I use this word carefully, normal? Do you sense that things are in a way post-coronavirus, or are you still sort of deep into it? It's not over yet.
I do not think it's over, no, because we're still seeing numbers increasing. But I think post-COVID-19, we're just going to see how bad the situation actually is in Lebanon, because now we're not actually getting a sense of it. So we're going to see how many restaurants and businesses have actually closed, and the size of the actual problem and unemployment, and we need to have solutions. I think we're past having the luxury of just planning things, and we need to start getting things on the ground moving.
That is the best segue, I think, into the subject that we're going to tackle. I think it couldn't be said better. I'm going to start just by introducing a recent piece you wrote. I think it was for Executive Magazine. It was 2 or 3 weeks back. It was the first week of May. Lebanon's new electricity plan. And there's a byline, which I really enjoyed, an exercise in trust. And there's this almost I know that the impact is not meant to be comedic, but it is comedic because it's a repetition. It's an ongoing thing that we all know about. That plan, that sort of existential plan that doesn't get anywhere. But then you focus in on trust and accountability. Do you sense this time around, given the last 6-7 months of what we both experienced in Lebanon, that sort of upswell of demand for accountability and transparency, and like you said, a system that works, institutions that work? Do you think this time around there is a moment to capture? And what I mean by that is, do you sense that this issue, electricity reform, is finally on the table and that it's going to be potentially fixed? Or in your mind, is this sort of just we're familiar with this terrain, we're going to see it eventually just die, the way we've seen all these different plans die in the past?
I just want to mention that I actually wrote that a year ago, but your confusion is actually quite right, quite accurate, because nothing has changed.
Oh, I apologize.
No, it's fine, because actually it's very legit, because in that 1 year framework, really nothing has happened on the ground.
I'm embarrassed.
Says a lot about just in the electricity sector in Lebanon. It's just so many plans and talks and nothing actually happening.
Okay, I'm embarrassed because I actually do my research diligently. I'd never I saw this being shared recently on Twitter, I think. So I actually was sort of,
Yeah, because I reshared it recently because of that.
Okay, but that perfect.
Your confusion is just, seriously, it's just a reaction of everything that's going on in the power sector. It's planning, talking about reforms, and nothing actually happening. So if I go through all my pieces that I wrote last year or before, it's just going to be, it actually applies for now. Do I think that this time is going to trigger some sort of reforms? So if we look into the power sector reforms in many countries across the world, they're more normally triggered by a crisis, which could be an unsustainable debt, like the case of Lebanon. So you need to have political will to implement reforms. Yeah. And when you have absence of political will in a business as usual scenario, then a crisis can actually make it happen. Now, the bad thing is that if we look into the political scene in Lebanon, everyone is still acting as if it's still business as usual. So it's a very part. So we're not actually responding to the crisis the way it should be, not on the economic level, but also not on the power sector level. So we're seeing just we're continuing with the plans that have actually written something else on so many of the shortcomings of the plan.
Right.
These things are going, so we can discuss that later. And we're continuing in the same kind of planning and momentum, which lacks sustainability, lacks a long-term vision to start with, and a good governance structure.
So it's
for reforms.
And in a way, it is kind of fitting that this could be written any of the last maybe 5 or even 10 years, that it's kind of the continuous disappointment. But do you sense that, and I understand where you're in a way, it's an admittance that the political situation it hasn't reached the tipping point where they see citizen demands as critical to their own survivability. But do you sense that the protest movement has within it that sort of push, that something like the electricity sector could be reformed to a point, not necessarily no magic solutions here, but just that there is going to be improvements on the horizon? Or is it still a lost cause in your heart? Because I ask this because you're somebody that is you're fluent in this sort of subject, and I just want to know your own immediate instinctual feeling on whether or not this will improve in the short term.
I would personally say I haven't given up. That might actually lead to something good. It might be the past protest, but it might also be the future protest as well. Because the way things are moving, we're not seeing actual reforms, there's no accountability, there's no citizens' trust in the government, and the government, there's no perception from the citizens' part that the government is keen on implementing reforms that fall in the benefits of the citizen. And that in any kind of reform, whether in the power sector or the broader economy or anything, is a critical factor. If you do not have citizens' trust, then any kind of reform is not going to go through, and it's not going to be efficient. So building that trust will require the government to actually doing things kind of the right way.
Now, I like that you're saying that it's potentially the answers are in future protests. And before we recorded, we were kind of exchanging the power of a place like Martyrs Square, meaning that the protest movement is probably the only way forward, given what we know, that all state institutions need massive reform. But all that said, I wanted to ask you about the adjustment to abnormality, and I think you hinted at that earlier. We, for the most part, not all of us, for the most part, sort of navigate this terrain by getting generator subscriptions that we kind of just, if you're in Beirut, usually it's 3 hours a day, if not longer, like last Monday. And we kind of navigate that. You pay a premium on it, and you live and you adjust accordingly. And if it's a city like Tripoli, for example, perhaps 12 hours a day, people pay a lot in generator subscriptions. And I'm pointing in on this issue because I'm curious about the hindrances that prevent the average person from demanding more, at least earlier, because it's almost like any issue that needs reform. And when it comes to the Lebanese state, the citizens are quick to adapt because they don't think there's going to be anything fixed in the short, medium, or even long term. But is that psychological component part of the story that we've learned to navigate without depending on government electricity?
It's a double-edged sword, no?
Yeah, exactly.
In a way, the Lebanese people have become so numb about anything. So when you're actually demanding any kind of basic rights, the electricity is a basic right. When the electricity utility is state-owned, it's supposed to be provided by the government. It's the least you can do. So as Lebanese people, we've become so numb and we don't trust the government that we hear that a lot. It's just Lebanon. This is the way Lebanon is. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it has provided this kind of, for Lebanese to kind of do well anywhere they go because they adapt well and they provide alternatives to everything. On the other side, you're supposed to actually demand accountability and basic rights and services. So we don't do that because we just kind of numb on all of this stuff. Right. But when we look into the power sector, so in the past, the Lebanese have actually been a lot, on the majority at least, because not everyone does have a generator, and that's very important to mention. Yes. We do not have equity of and justice in the service provision. So as you mentioned, the farther you are from the capital, the longer the electricity shortage you face, and you're paying a high bill for the generators. And a lot of people, especially in rural areas, do not have a generator subscription. It impacts businesses, the ability to actually start a business or run it. It impacts the entire economy, productive activities. It impacts competitiveness because when you're, as a business, you're paying a high bill for the generator, especially your competitiveness on the regional and international level is low. So it results in more trade imbalance and all these factors. But moving forward, so now we have this crisis is also, so we have an economic crisis, a political crisis, a social crisis, but we also have a shortage of foreign reserves. Right. So you need dollars to actually import fuel, whether it's for generators or for the electricity utility. And as this would run out and would decrease, and you'll have shortage of electricity, not only on the electricity utility side, but also on the generator side. So these are going to actually, so you're going to actually have, if this, and I'm just speaking in a way, if the government keeps this business as usual scenario and they keep acting the way they are now, so we're heading to a longer shortage of electricity and actual blackout where the citizen doesn't have neither generator or electricity utility. And this is why I mentioned the future protests. That's actually a very destabilizing factor.
So it's in a way, in the short term, there's a good chance that things will get worse, at least in this sector. I'm sorry to even that's a very that's a very bleak assessment with a smile, which is why I want to get deeper into this. I share the sentiment with you, but is it that because the state is so incapable of reforming and handling crises that you see it perhaps getting worse?
So I find it illogical to assume that the same people who got you in the crisis first are going to be able to pull you out of it. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So you need, if there was any leadership on the state level in any sector, we wouldn't get to this. So reforms normally have required a champion everywhere in the world.
Yes.
And it has never happened that the champion has been there for 10, 20 or 30 years and then they wake up one day and they champion anything. So it has to be a new leader with actual leader skills, because we have political parties. I call them da'im. I shy away from using the term actual leader because we have a very crisis of leadership in Lebanon.
I'm glad you've said a few things that I'll try to link and I'll gauge your mind. I like that you've pointed out at almost the that there's an immediacy to the problem. And I've had several conversations the last few weeks where the time issue is so important that you can't simply wait too long for things to improve. So there's that time factor. But there's also another issue which you're describing, that for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, it's familiar faces, it's familiar ideas, it's familiar ways of governing, and it's 3 decades or even older. So it's something that both of us have grown up with in Lebanon. And these two things are kind of reaching a crossroads. And then in the background, you have citizen demands that are not being met. And then, of course, you have all these other bigger problems that you've described. And then there's a shortage of fuel. And I hope I got this right, that the electricity sector on its own, it's about $2 billion a year in terms of expenses. So, I mean, that's... I guess what I'm asking is, can we wait for the protesters to yield structural change, or are we forced at the moment to pressure the current regime into doing its basic job? And I guess I'm looking at it as, can we wait a few years? Because I assume this will take years. It's not something that will happen anytime soon. Or do we have that luxury, or are we forced to point the finger at what's available and say, we need to hold you to account?
So I think it's not either or. It just have to run simultaneously, because yes, it does take several years to have new faces or a better performing system. And it's like whatever it is, but you need to act in different phases and on different levels. So once if we go back to the smaller sectorial level of the power sector, we need to fix first the governance structure, and that can't wait. And you need to provide electricity, but we need to do it with the most sustainable path to a long-term actual sustainable plan. Right. So now the power sector has been ad hoc. We're going to implement this, get to power barges, and the government has always used that sense of urgency to actually compromise sustainability and building something that's sustainable and least cost. So we've seen it's urgent now, we have to get electricity because otherwise it's doomsday. And then I've personally been hearing that for the past 20 or 10 years. So it was urgent, when the first official policy paper in 2010, it was very urgent. So we got the power barges and we didn't implement any permanent power plant. So if I'm just going to tell you this, and it's I'm so ashamed of saying it publicly, but the last time Lebanon has built a power plant was in 1999.
Right, and that's not even a very big power plant.
Right. And these things have been in the works since 1882. So it's not rocket science.
Okay, so I'm glad you say that, and as somebody who's naive in the subject, just want to just ask you, and you say as much as you'd like about this. There are many things that worked not that long ago in Lebanese history. Unfortunately, it's before our time, but it's our parents' generation, our grandparents, and maybe even before them as well. Transportation was a lot more sensible. It's just bizarre still to see these sort of railway tracks next to the highway at times, and you just sort of look at them. This is from the late 19th century, right? That's early on in modern Lebanese history, and we did that. I have stories of my parents and perhaps even grandparents drinking from the tap, that the water was clean. And we used to we used to produce more electricity than we needed. Up until I think the Civil War, if I'm not mistaken, there was a surplus of power generation. And then you have the post-Civil War order, which in my mind just resembles the Civil War with a lot of patchwork, a lot of cosmetics, and it's not a proper restructuring of what should be a functioning state. Today in 2020, you have all this all these great policy plans, and I actually had fun watching you survive an interview on TV on TRT, and you were I think you were in Bangkok, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so you were way from the problem. But there were two, all discussing the Lebanese power sector, and you have what seem to be decent ideas being expressed, and you can read these policy plans. There's not. The intention is always good, and there are decent people that do try at times. But then you have also this sort of lethargic power sharing machine that seems to curtail all decent ideas in Lebanon today. And if I'm just going to ask you a specific question here, where does the problem lie? If you were to address the core issue of why it's so difficult to generate power in Lebanon and sustain it, and to reform an important sector like the electricity sector, what is the core issue? Is it simply just a matter of pure corruption, that we're not able to tackle corruption? Or is it mismanagement, that we have incompetent people running the ministry? I guess because somebody who's an expert, if you will, on this issue, what is the core issue that needs to be fixed?
Okay, so what you mentioned about the services that used to work in the past in Lebanon is actually very important. It's my point of view that after the wars, the system that was built or actually remained in transition for 30 years now was just put in place to be a deterrent for any violent act, any kind of clashes between the different sectarian communities in Lebanon. So it was kind of making sure that nobody is going to actually clash with each other or go into a war. At least that's how it remained in the transition period for 30 years.
Right.
So we didn't evolve into an actual state. We remained in that limbo for 3 decades. Right. And that has resulted in a way in ensuring that everyone has a say, but everyone has a share of the pie. So nobody has any incentive to actually change whether any sector or the actual build a state. And we see it, I think, the most obvious in the power sector because it's tangible service. We're not just talking about something that's abstract. So you can actually find it in the power sector. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were going to ask.
No, but because it's something that it's crazy that we got so used to this problem. But yeah, it impacts everybody in Lebanon. Sorry, so I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, go ahead.
No, but it's exactly... That's my point of view. So by ensuring that everyone gets a share of the pie of everything in Lebanon, you're actually ensuring that there's no actual opposition or actual competition. So I normally refer to it as competition because for anything to thrive, you need a competition. As an individual, if you don't have a competition, you're not going to try to improve anything. And that applies for the economy, for the power sector, but also for the state level. So everyone is just sitting there not having any incentive to actually change anything because everyone is just happy with things being as they are.
But when you say competition, I hope I got this right, and I've read some of your pieces and watched you and listened to your interviews, that it doesn't necessarily mean privatization, that you're not sort of encouraging the private sector, at least the way we know it in Lebanon, to take over, that would resemble the state's mismanagement too. I hope I got that right.
Yeah, so I personally do not believe that privatization would work in a state like Lebanon because you need to have a specific context for privatization to actually work, starting with transparency, good governance, being able to actually put a value on the asset, and a lot of factors that are not there in Lebanon. So no, and this is why I advocate for competition, not privatization. So privatization is just, at the full privatization level, is just changing the ownership from the state to an actual company. It's one company, so there's no competition on the market.
Right.
And this is why once you have more companies and you have private sector engagements, like through PPPs, but also PPPs like public-private partnership should be put in a specific framework and regulation and ensuring the right procurement, solid procurement process. Otherwise, it might just fall back into a monopoly.
So can I ask you, though, what does competition then look like the way we know it in Lebanon, at least in this sector? What would that translate to?
So we might actually unbundle the power sector. So the power sector has kind of subsectors, which is generation, distribution, and transmission. So the state can keep this transmission through the power headlines. And you can actually unbundle. So there would be like 3, 4, maybe 5 companies doing the generation, other doing the distribution.
I see.
So that's to do that. Or you can actually do the public-private partnership, which was actually the 2019 policy paper had a focus on PPP. But there's a PPP law in Lebanon. It was passed in 2017. It's Law 48. That's bypassed for the electricity sector. Although in its Article 7, I think, it just emphasized that this applies for the power sector.
Right.
And you need a solid procurement framework because you might actually tender a lot of projects and they can actually fall back to the same owner, to the same company.
Right.
So this is why you put regulations against monopoly and you do an actual transparent kind of procurement.
So you've pointed out a few things that I've been sort of thinking to myself mostly in New York during coronavirus, sort of just trying to figure out this topic before speaking to you. And you've hinted at, and you've said this in several ways, that the end of the civil war is in a way, the biggest victim is the Lebanese state. That post-civil war, the Lebanese state is the first in a way to erode, and that's sort of it's almost like a warlike militia intrusion into the state and then taking bits and pieces of it and using it for ill gain. 30 years ago. In the last 30 years, are there particulars in that where you see potentially big obstacles that are too difficult to overcome, at least when it comes to things like the protest movement or for that matter, an IMF bailout or even unlocking the said money? Are there big problems that cannot be fixed unless the whole state is in a way repaired? And I guess what I'm asking is, does it go beyond power sharing simply? Are there corrupt factors within that have sort of taken over certain sectors? And you say as much as you'd like about this, I'm not trying to even name names here in particular, but just the idea of tackling what's left of the state and holding people to account. To me, it sounds great. It's something I would want to, but I find it very, very difficult to see certain things happening. Yeah. So, it's easier always. It's always easier said than and I'll just give an example. The generator industry. That's one sort of very clear sort of obstacle. And yeah. So
the generators is just one of the many vested interests in the sector. And the longer you normally have a crisis, and it doesn't only apply to Lebanon, it applies to everywhere. The longer the crisis actually is happening, the more vested interest you're going to have.
Yeah.
You have the fuel economy, you have the generators, you have the procurement, you have an entire vested interest everywhere.
Yes.
And that's the power sector and then everything in the state of Lebanon. So it's very hard to actually change that. But we've seen in so many places in the world, if you do have a champion, and they might actually make it happen. So the face I have for Lebanon, and I know it's not something that's going to happen overnight, and I want to stress that reforms, whether in the power sector or in Lebanon in general, throughout the entire economy, is probably not going to be straightforward or linear. It might actually fall back in some places. It might take several years, but we have to keep pushing forward and engage all the stakeholders. So it's citizens, civil society, organizations, you have the experts, academics, you have the government, but everyone, we need to come to that stage where there is public consultation, where everyone is actually involved. So the hope I have for Lebanon is that one generational change, I think that's the top of it. if I look into the entire Middle East, so the Middle East has the largest youth population, and most of that is actually unemployed. It's more than 30% on average, and that's double the global average. So unemployment for the young population is normally a destabilizing factor, which means that and the way I see it in the Middle East, these young people now with internet, now they can travel, now they see how easy it is actually to have services. It's not something that's very hard to implement. You just need accountability and good governance. And I find that more and more they're stressing for these factors and for accountability. Of course, there's a risk in that, and the more you have unemployment and the government cannot tailor that for that, it might actually lead to more extremism or more immigration. But when immigration, it was hard prior to COVID-19, and post-COVID-19 it might get even worse. And with unemployment rising everywhere in the world, so I think that it might be just the opportunity that these young people in Lebanon are going to have to say, I cannot actually keep running away from Lebanon. I'm gonna have to actually fix it in a way.
So let me understand this right. You're betting on the future, and you're betting on the youth that don't have the baggage that maybe even we have. Somebody sort of like, we're not necessarily kids on the street. We maybe have some perspective, and our parents clearly lived through the worst years of Lebanese history, modern history. That you're betting on a sizable number of Lebanese that don't have the power sharing tradition that we have. Did I get that right? That they're going to look beyond the way modern Lebanon was formed, and they'll see things. Okay.
I think that's my hope, actually.
No, because it's a big demand for the youth, and I think I agree with you that if anyone has it, it's them. But do you see them as seeing it that way too, or is this something that they're not even aware of per se? They just want things to work, and that's more than enough.
So I find that they're built in different ways. So maybe the former generation is like our parents' generation was more focused on religion and all this stuff because they were raised with that idea, and especially being through a war, and they were raised through that idea that the other entity, whatever that other thing is going to be, mostly religion in Lebanon, is standing in the way of you getting any kind of services or any kind of actual state. So the politicians have raised fear to be able to govern. And I find that this young population actually doesn't buy this, and they're not as sectarian. They're not sectarian like they're definitely still sectarian young population in Lebanon, but there are a lot of people who just do not care about this anymore and do not find it as something that's a division factor for Lebanon, and they just realize that actually stressing on sectarianism and religion and all this stuff have stood in the way of anyone getting any kind of service. So it's not, nobody's getting electricity in Lebanon. It's not one religious community.
Exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's clear. I mean, it's always been odd that Tripoli's such a big population gets half a day's electricity. That is rather bizarre. But that's the rest of the country. That's not just Tripoli per se. So you're absolutely right. Beirut is it's the exception.
It was an exception. I think so. The most of the businesses are actually located in Beirut. So Beirut used to have 21 hours of electricity supply. I do find that at some point in time, especially for the highest consumers, subsidy should have been eliminated a long time ago. But that was political, I understand. But it's like the easiest way to eliminate subsidy, and it's like a lot of politicians now just try to blame subsidy for all the problems of the power sector and all the debt from the power sector. The easiest way to remove subsidy would have been to provide 24/7 electricity. And
right. Yeah, absolutely.
Get me electricity and remove the subsidy, it's fine. And it goes beyond subsidy. That Lebanon generates very expensive electricity. There is a very high losses from the grid, but also non-technical losses. And it's not only illegal connections. connections on the grid, but there is also billing and a non-collection from the state utility. So and this is why I always stress on the governance. This all entirely falls into providing a better governance job.
But can I ask you? These are very. You're able to almost list them, and there's maybe 3 or 4 obvious things. Is power sharing the issue there? Because I find it odd. You should be able to just collect the electricity bill. You should be able to check the meter. You should be able to maintain the grid. Is it that power sharing is the boogeyman here? And I'm asking them just like the basic day-to-day workings of a ministry like energy and water.
I cannot speak on their behalf, and I'm not going to justify anything or anyone. What I know is that it's power sharing and vested interests in the sector. But what I know is that it's a job. Being a minister is actually a job. It's a public service job. So it's not prestige. It's not just the way it's being kind of referred to in the past in Lebanon. And it's not something like, I like you, so I'm going to name you minister. It's not supposed to be like that, at least. So it's a job. And if you do not perform in your job, I don't know which company in the world would keep you in a job if you're not performing. And if you're working in a company that's losing money every single year, in the past decade in Lebanon, the cost of the power sector has been $1.6 billion on average every year. So that's for a country in US dollars. That's for a country that it's a foreign currency. It's a country that's indebted. You do not have any kind of. You're just losing money. So the first thing that anyone should have done, and it's a basic thing for people to actually demand, is someone to look into how can I actually save on that money being spent. And that seems like today we're in 2020. And we're realizing there was fuel issues that no one was aware of and other things, which means that at least on this section, nobody was actually trying to reduce the debt. And on the other hand, nobody was implementing power plants or even promoting renewable energy as it should be. So we're in a state, we have a non-functioning sector for 30 years that's non-justifiable for anyone. And it's like, if I was in a job and I wasn't doing it, nobody would have kept me. So why do we expect the ministers to not do that job and just to stick to it?
It's really interesting. So it almost goes to it's like a pathological problem that the Lebanese state, the last 30 years, is a state that just simply doesn't work the way we understand it. It almost, by default, it looks at the issue and ignores it. Because I get the feeling that all of these long-term problems were never looked into. And I'll give you an example. I mean, whenever there's traffic heading north, I take the coastal road, and you drive by Zoo, and you see that monster, and I mean, that it needs repair. Just by looking at it, you kind of feel bad for it at times. It's like, how is that thing still standing? And then next to it is a barge, a Turkish sort of power barge linked to it, and one assumes that will temporarily maybe heal wounds. And it doesn't. The electricity sector does not improve. And then it's almost like, okay, that costs money. And it costs money to even maintain that kind of power plant. Is that part of the funnel that we're throwing money at at things that should have been dismantled long ago? Is it just sort of a naive way of putting Band-Aids on it? And then the Turkish barge is just sort of a show that we're trying and not able to? I'm trying to get at the maybe the psychological component.
So the way I look at it, this is like an example of doing that. It's like you have a house that has no walls. So every time you're trying to heat that house, you're actually paying a lot of heating. You cannot actually heat it because you don't have
right.
So it's costing you a lot in operation and maintenance and everything.
Yeah.
So you need to buy a new house. You need to buy a new house. So that house has no walls. It's actually the inefficient aging power plants that are not actually being maintained as a preventive measures as it should be.
Right.
So these are the house you have with no walls. And then, so you need to build a new house. So instead you go and rent a hotel. But you convince yourself that the hotel is actually costing me less than my house. But
that's interesting. Okay, so it's
a house.
So it's long-term temporary mismanagement of funds.
And that temporary solution has cost more than twice than actually building a power plant.
Right, and that's the biggest expense for the state. If I understood that right, electricity costs the most every year. There's nothing that sort of it's
so
part.
I think it's 3%, 3 to 4%.
3 to 4%. Okay, I mean, the reason I ask you in a very naive way because I try to keep this sort of. It is something so basic, yet it shouldn't be that much of a headache to fix, and that's why when you say the champions need to come and sort of take reign, are you implying here that we have to wait for civil society, we have to wait for the protest movement to structure itself and organize and perhaps nominate the people that we want to see? Is it by championing, meaning we need literally a political movement to take shape that we haven't seen yet? Or is it something else?
So I do believe that new political parties have to emerge at a state or the other. I'm not advocating for waiting for anything because, as we've said earlier, the Lebanese state in its current state cannot wait for anything. But this is why we need to involve everyone, whether it's civil society organizations, the Lebanese public, experts, academics, and the government to sit together to try to actually move this in a sustainable manner until you can actually change the entire state. So the entire state needs to be. We don't have functioning service at any level, so that needs to be changed. So I would advocate more for decentralization, and I find that. So the power sector, and I want to mention that before, the power sector is a huge mess in so many places in the world because it's very technical that it can be. It's very technical, but it's also is used a lot as a political vehicle.
Right.
So it's also there are so many vested interests in the power sector in most of the developing countries in the world. So it's very hard to actually implement efficient reforms in the power sector. But in no way it should be like 30 years you do not have anything functioning.
30 years and also a fairly small population too. It's not like we're talking millions and it's a small population. Yeah.
It's a city literally elsewhere.
Yeah.
But when you have a state like Lebanon and you have a monopoly of a state-owned utility, electricity du Liban, that's losing money every year. The easiest way to tackle it when you cannot actually change it, have an entire major overhaul, is to decrease the monopoly and to make sure that whoever can actually generate electricity is allowed, is actually supported to do that, because that decreases the pressure on the utility. Because as long as the state now is generating electricity, it's losing money.
Yeah.
So the easiest way to tackle this would be to encourage people to generate their own electricity, to reduce the monopoly, and to decentralize, and of course to promote renewable energy. And renewable energy could have played a major role in this.
Right.
And I want to mention this because in Lebanon, it's not just that we have issues in implementation and executing policies, and even when we do have good policies, then we have issues in implementation. Like we do have a net metering policy. That's actually entails that if you do have a renewable energy system in your facility, you can submit an application to EDL and request a bi-directional meter. So you can give the excess of electricity you're producing to the grid and pay kind of difference. And you might actually carry credit if it's in your favor. But if you do go and that's a good policy, but if you go and submit an application, I've heard instances where some people have been waiting for 2 years to get that meter. And so now with the economic crisis, we have issues in getting a loan for anything, but we do have also a financing mechanism called NERA for renewable energy. But the process also takes a long period of time. So some of these things could have literally alleviated a bit of the pressure when communities were able and I've heard of so many villages and towns who were actually willing to implement solar for the entire village or so. These things should have been promoted more and supported because they reduce the pressure on the electricity.
Okay, I'll wrap it up just by addressing 2 points. The first, you said decentralization. Is the Zahle example part of that decentralization, or is that something else? Is that an unrelated issue?
It's actually a good example, and it's a good question, because Zahle has 24/7 electricity because it has a concession. So Zahle has a concession, I think from 1924, was it? So they have a concession to distribute and generate electricity. So what they have is generators, just big generators.
Right, yeah.
But the issue is Zahle is that Zahle was getting electricity from EDL at a subsidized rate, at a very low rate, and also has its own generator.
Mm-hmm.
So the issue was, I find that the finances should have been fixed in a way, because it was also adding pressure because it was getting subsidized electricity. So you need to improve that financial model, right, and probably encourage it in a way, especially when the state cannot afford as well to keep losing money. So now we don't have money to lose.
Do they still have 24-hour electricity even today?
Yeah, so what I understand is that now it's under the management of the government.
Oh, so it went back. It reverted to.
But they still have 24.
Oh, okay. But that's an example of letting Zahle dictate its terms. Is that decentralization, that you would see other regions in a way able to have more autonomy in the electricity sector?
So Lebanon is very small, as you mentioned. So we need 3 power plants. There's a political debate on where these 3 should be. Salata is not necessarily a needed power plant, but so you need a few power plants, but you can decentralize renewable energy, and actually, so towns and villages especially could have had this kind of hybrid model where they link whoever could afford to install. So now I don't know with the crisis how things are, but so many villages were willing to actually finance solar PV system that could be linked in a hybrid model to the generator. So they reduce the fuel consumption from the generator. When you don't have solar radiation enough, you use the generator, and that could have helped and eased a lot of, first on the fuel imports, and second on the electricity utility.
Okay, so in a way it's tested only in Zahle.
So there are several who had concessions. There was Electricité de Alay, Electricité de Jbel, Adisha, and Zahle.
So Jbel did have that kind of arrangement too, with the.
Jbel has the Electricité de Jbel has their own generators, but you also feel the power cut, unlike there's a power, but the utility, yeah.
Okay, so that's decentralization hasn't really properly been tested, with the exception of something like.
So it wasn't. I find that a good model would be a hybrid model of both centralized, of 3 power plants, and then centralized utility scale renewable energy, but also promote decentralized small scale renewable energy, especially for productive activities, especially for industries, because it does reduce the costs that now they're paying from the diesel generators, and it does improve competitiveness.
It seems so straightforward, and that's kind of the perplexing issue for me. It's that you can kind of that's one way forward, and it's never really been done. So I hope this time around the protest movement has within it to at least test these things with the champions that you're referring to. The last point, I want to wrap it up here, which is in a way it's being discussed left and right now. It's this IMF bailout, and it's Cedr as well, unlocking that money. Do you think that kind of assistance can contribute to reform in the electricity sector? That there will be enough conditions, and there will be enough accounting, that there will be enough sort of oversight where you could see the beginning of state reform, at least on the top. It's almost like on an international level, looking at the Lebanese state, not the protest movement per se. It's not that bottom-up pressure, but in a sense, top-down. Top meaning IMF or Cedr, and down meaning the Lebanese state and how we know it.
I'm never going to promote an IMF program. I know that austerity is very hard for everyone.
Okay.
So, but it's like what we need first is accountability and transparency and good governance and for a vision for the sector. So now I hear a lot. So there are policies and plans for the sector, but it's like, what's the vision of the power sector? What the power sector is going to look like? Not just tomorrow, but in a 10-year period or. So we don't have that. And that doesn't come from an IMF program. It comes from people willing to actually change their country. And can I indulge in self-promotion? I have.
I mean, yes, you can, but as long as at some point you put on a mask with a fake mustache and the glasses, and you nominate yourself as Minister of Electricity. But I think I know her, but she sounds familiar.
I was gonna aim for president.
Oh, you're aiming. Oh, I see. Isn't that sort of a secondary post though? Don't you want power? Literally power.
So everyone is just wants to be president. Why not me?
Self-promote as much as you'd like.
I'm not Maronite. I don't have an eye on presidency or anything. But I just wanted to say that I wrote a piece on the reforms, and it's not necessarily that any reforms are going to be efficient reforms, and that it's actually a long process, and everyone needs to be, and you need to engage all stakeholders, build, so the piece is not out, but it's going to be out in the next few days. That was the self-promotion.
Oh, okay.
But it actually revolves around having a vision and good governance structure, and then engaging citizens, building their trust, but also building the trust of investors, which comes through a good regulatory framework and solid procurement. Because at any point in time, some of the major shortcomings of reforms in developing countries is that the power sector does not attract enough investment, so it does fall back into issues and shortcomings. So you need to be able to attract investment, which you need to improve your governance, your procurement, and also your regulation. Reducing subsidy alone doesn't cut it for Lebanon. We need to have cheap generation. So we need to adopt the least cost planning for the sector. We need to cut down on losses, but governments normally just overestimate how easy it is to cut down on losses and a lot of bunch of other stuff. So reforms could be triggered, and this is my key message. Economic crisis can trigger reforms, but we need to all push forward to have efficient reforms and sustainable power sector.
You know, I like that you're keeping the focus on local politics and domestic accountability, and I also find I agree that the answers should not come outside of Lebanon, and if they do, they should be lining up with protester demands, and it is up for Lebanese at the end of the day to determine how they want to live in Lebanon. And I agree with you. I hope the youth...
Can I add one?
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
It's not protesters' demand. I feel it's just literally just basic citizens' right to have a performing power sector, to have electricity they're not paying a high cost for, and that's actually performing well. And it also applies to the other sectors. So the protesters are not asking for anything that's literally huge. That's just like basic rights, and this should be all citizens' demands to actually have a performing state.
In a way, it's part of the tragedy. I mean, in a way, it says the whole story, that a protester demanding something in Beirut is actually asking for his basic dignity.
Right.
And that's I think it's quite telling that how bad things have gotten in Lebanon. But to end it on a positive note, I'm glad you're able to kind of walk me through. It's almost like the idiot's guide to electricity reform. It's
very hard. It's very hard. It's very hard for everyone.
No.
And it's like, as you said, there's no magic trick. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and everything is fine. But people should be part of the process, and they should be engaged, and they should know how long it's actually going to take. And there should be transparency. Transparency is a key.
100%. I completely agree with you. Something we've lacked too long. And I'm going to link up a few pieces. Your executive piece from last year. Again, apologies for the year. I might even put 2025 just to see what happens. We'll be doing.
I hope not.
Yeah, me too. Although it does go to 2025, which is kind of maybe it's fitting. We should talk about it in 5 years. Also, there's a Forbes Middle East piece that I looked through recently. I believe it was released over a year ago. And I kind of, this was a sort of a back and forth between you and the previous Minister of Energy, Cesar Abu Khalid, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so there's that piece. And with your permission, once you have your upcoming piece released, I'll tag it to the episode. It'll be available. People listening and watching can click in. Jessica, thank you for taking all of this time. And thank you for keeping your electricity going. I don't know what kind of wasta you have, but it didn't go out. Didn't go out this time.
I just lit a candle and just prayed it won't go out.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your analogy of living in a home without walls. That's something I can see, and I it's almost like it's impossible to fix the way we've been trying. That it's time to sort of close that door and open a new one. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.